Ludwig van Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany, in December 1770, into a family deeply rooted in music. His grandfather, also named Ludwig van Beethoven, was a distinguished musician from Mechelen in what is now Belgium. After moving to Bonn at the age of 21, the elder Beethoven became a bass singer at the court of Clemens August, Archbishop-Elector of Cologne, eventually rising to the esteemed position of Kapellmeister. His portrait, which later hung in his grandson's room, served as a lasting reminder of the musical legacy that young Ludwig would inherit. Beethoven's father, Johann van Beethoven, followed in his father's path as a tenor at the same court and earned extra income by giving piano and violin lessons. In 1767, Johann married Maria Magdalena Keverish, the daughter of a court chef from Trier. From this union, Ludwig van Beethoven was born at what is now the Beethoven House Museum on Bonngasse 20. Though there is no official birth record, his baptism was registered at St. Remigius Church on December 17, 1770, and following the custom of the time, it is widely accepted that he was born the previous day, December 16, 1770. Of Johann and Maria's 7 children, only Ludwig and 2 younger brothers, Caspar Karl and Nikolaus Johann, survived infancy. Beethoven's first music teacher was his father, whose harsh and often relentless lessons were said to reduce the boy to tears. He later studied with Gilles van den Eden, the court organist, Tobias Friedrich Pfeiffer, a family friend who gave him late-night piano sessions, and Franz Anton Ries, the court concertmaster who instructed him on the violin. Despite the severity of his training, Beethoven's prodigious talent quickly became evident. By the age of 7, he gave his first public performance, promoted by his father as a child prodigy in the style of Mozart, though the posters falsely claimed he was 6. While his musical genius was undeniable, his academic skills were modest. Throughout his life, he preferred addition to multiplication, often performing calculations by hand in roundabout ways. From these disciplined yet humble beginnings, in a modest Bonn household now preserved as the Beethoven House Museum, emerged one of history's greatest composers. Born in the year 1770, baptized on December 17th, and almost certainly born on December 16th, Ludwig van Beethoven's early years shaped the restless, determined spirit that would one day transform the sound of music forever. In the year 1780 or 1781, the young Ludwig van Beethoven began studying under Christian Gottlob Neefe, the most significant teacher of his early years in Bonn. Neefe taught him composition and became a guiding force in shaping Beethoven's musical foundation. By the year 1783, at only 12 years old, Beethoven's first published work appeared, a set of keyboard variations, and that same year, his 3 piano sonatas, known as the Kurfürst sonatas, were dedicated to Elector Maximilian Friedrich. That year also saw the first printed mention of him in the Magazin der Musik, describing Louis van Beethoven, a boy of 11, of most promising talent. He plays the piano very skillfully and with power. Soon after, Beethoven became assistant organist to Neefe at the court chapel, first unpaid in year 1782, then formally employed by year 1784. When Maximilian Franz succeeded as Elector of Cologne, he continued to support the young musician, eventually appointing him court organist, and later assisting in financing Beethoven's move to Vienna in the year 1792. During these formative years, Beethoven found solace beyond his troubled home. His father's drinking had plunged the family into instability. In the warmth of the von Breuning family, a cultured household that treated him as one of their own. Helene von Breuning, the family matriarch, became a second mother to him, refining his manners and nurturing his love of literature and poetry. There, he formed close friendships with Franz Wegeler, a young medical student, and Count Ferdinand von Waldstein, who would become one of his first patrons and later commission his ballet Musik zu einem Ritterballett in the year 1791. Between the year 1785 and 1790, Beethoven's output as a composer slowed, perhaps due to family hardship and the mixed reception of his early works. In 1787, he briefly visited Vienna, possibly meeting Mozart, but returned home upon learning that his mother was gravely ill. She died that July, a devastating loss for the 16-year-old composer. 2 years later, his father's worsening alcoholism forced the court to redirect half of Johann's pension directly to Beethoven for the family's support. To sustain them, he reluctantly taught music and played viola in the court orchestra, where he absorbed the works of Mozart, Gluck, and Paisiello, and befriended the young composer Anton Reicha. From the years 1790 to 1792, Beethoven's creative maturity began to reveal itself. He composed several works, including variations and 2 ambitious cantatas, one mourning the death of Emperor Joseph II, and another celebrating the accession of Leopold II. These pieces, rediscovered in the 1880s, prompted Johannes Brahms to call them Beethoven through and through. Beethoven likely first met Joseph Haydn in late 1790 when Haydn passed through Bonn en route to London. When they met again 2 years later, after Haydn's return, arrangements were made for Beethoven to study under him in Vienna. As he prepared to leave Bonn, his friend Count Waldstein wrote him a farewell that became prophetic. "You are going to Vienna in fulfillment of your long frustrated wishes. With the help of assiduous labor, you shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands." It was the beginning of Beethoven's true journey from the quiet halls of Bonn to the grand concert rooms of Vienna, where he would rise from student to master and from mortal to legend. In November 1792, Ludwig van Beethoven left Bonn for Vienna, just as the winds of revolution and war began to sweep across Europe from France. Shortly after his departure, he received word that his father had died. Arriving in Vienna, Beethoven devoted himself not to fame, but to study and mastery, aware that many saw him as the natural successor to Mozart, who had died the previous year. Under the tutelage of Joseph Haydn, Beethoven immersed himself in counterpoint, striving to perfect the craft of composition. He also took lessons in violin with Ignaz Schuppanzig and studied Italian vocal composition with Antonio Salieri, a mentorship that continued well into the next decade. When Haydn left for England in 1794, Beethoven was expected to return to Bonn, but the fall of his hometown to French forces and the growing recognition of his talent in Vienna convinced him to stay. Noble patrons such as Prince Joseph Franz Lobkowitz, Prince Karl Lichnowsky, and Baron Gottfried van Swieten soon offered him financial and artistic support. By 1793, Beethoven's reputation as a piano virtuoso and improviser spread rapidly among Vienna's aristocracy. He frequently performed in salons, dazzling audiences with his fiery style and imagination. His early compositions began appearing in print through the efforts of his friend Nikolaus Simrock, though Beethoven often delayed publication to heighten their impact. In 1795, he made his public debut in Vienna, performing one of his own piano concertos at the Burgtheater. The performance marked the formal beginning of his career. That same year, he published the 3 piano trios, Opus 1, dedicated to Prince Lichnowsky, a success that nearly covered his living expenses for a year. Soon after, he astonished Vienna's musical elite by winning a series of piano duels, first against Joseph Wölfel and later against Daniel Steibelt, cementing his image as the city's most formidable pianist. His 8th piano sonata, the Pathétique, 1799, was hailed as a breakthrough in emotional power and originality. Between 1798 and 1800, Beethoven composed his first 6-string quartets for Prince Lobkowitz, along with the popular septet, 1799. With the premieres of his First Symphony, 1800, and Second Symphony, 1803, Beethoven emerged as the most important young composer of his generation, a successor to Haydn and Mozart, yet already distinct in his bold modulations, dramatic contrasts, and emotional depth. The premiere of his First Symphony, held on April 2nd, 1800, featured an ambitious program that included works by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven himself, showcasing his growing confidence and ambition. During this period, Beethoven also began teaching piano to the daughters of the Brunswick family, falling deeply in love with the younger Josephine Brunswick. His affections, however, went unfulfilled due to class differences. Among his other students were Ferdinand Ries, who later chronicled his experiences with the composer, and Karl Czerny, who would go on to become a celebrated pianist and teacher. Czerny's recollection paints an earthy portrait of Beethoven, a disheveled, intense man with wild black hair and unshaven cheeks, exuding both genius and volatility. In 1801, Beethoven met Countess Julie Guicciardi through the Brunswick family and dedicated to her one of his most beloved works, the Moonlight Sonata. That same year, he completed his ballet, The Creatures of Prometheus, a popular success that saw multiple performances and a rushed publication to meet public demand. By 1802, he had completed his Second Symphony, performed the following year at the Theater an der Wien, where he had become composer in residence. The program, which included his First Symphony, Third Piano Concerto, and Christ on the Mount of Olives, was a financial triumph despite mixed reviews. Around this time, his brother Caspar began managing his business affairs, negotiating better payments from publishers, and persuading Beethoven, often against his will, to authorize arrangements and transcriptions of his works. Though resistant, Beethoven accepted, knowing that publishers would otherwise proceed without his consent. By the dawn of the 19th century, Beethoven's reputation had grown beyond that of a pianist or composer. He was seen as the new voice of musical revolution. With each symphony and sonata, he expanded the boundaries of sound and emotion, standing at the threshold of an era that would soon be called Romanticism. By the early years of the 19th century, Ludwig van Beethoven stood at the height of his rising fame, a daring composer whose music was reshaping Europe's understanding of emotion and sound. Yet, even as his genius flourished, a silent catastrophe began to unfold. In 1798, during what he later described to the English pianist Charles Neate as a heated quarrel with a singer, Beethoven first noticed a persistent ringing in his ears. It was the beginning of his progressive hearing loss, accompanied by a severe case of tinnitus. Over the next few years, the condition worsened until even ordinary sounds began to fade. By 1801, he confessed his fears in letters to his friends Franz Wegeler and Karl Amenda, writing of the isolation, humiliation, and despair caused by his growing deafness. The most likely cause, modern physicians believe, was otosclerosis, a disease that gradually hardens the bones of the inner ear, possibly combined with nerve degeneration. In 1802, following his doctor's advice, Beethoven withdrew to the quiet village of Heiligenstadt, just outside Vienna, to rest and come to terms with his illness. There, in deep despair, he penned the now famous Heiligenstadt Testament, a letter to his brothers in which he confessed his thoughts of suicide and his resolve to continue living only for his art. "I will seize fate by the throat. It shall not crush me completely," he wrote, vowing that his suffering would serve his genius rather than destroy it. By the 1810s, Beethoven's condition had advanced to near total deafness. Though he could still sense low tones and vibrations, by his mid-40s he could no longer hear spoken words or music in any ordinary sense. Yet he continued to compose, not from sound, but from memory, from imagination, and from the echo of a world he could no longer hear. Deaf, isolated and misunderstood, Beethoven turned inward, producing music of astonishing power and depth, symphonies, sonatas, and quartets that transcended the limits of human perception. What began as tragedy became transformation. From silence, he created eternity. Beethoven's return from Heiligenstadt to Vienna in late 1802 marked not only a turning point in his life, but also a rebirth of his art. The despair that had nearly consumed him during his retreat gave way to defiance, and from that defiance, a new creative force emerged. His style grew bolder, broader, and more dramatic, ushering in what historians now call his middle or heroic period. Reflecting on this transformation, Beethoven reportedly told his student Carl Czerny, "I am not satisfied with the work I have done so far. From now on, I intend to take a new way." The first great monument of this new direction was the Third Symphony in E-flat major, completed in 1804. Originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, whom Beethoven admired as a symbol of liberty and revolution, the symphony was first titled Bonaparte. But when Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven furiously tore away the title page, renaming the piece Eroica, heroic. It was longer, grander, and more emotionally charged than anything the world had yet heard. When it premiered in 1805, critics were divided. Some were awed by its scale, others bewildered. Yet its legacy would redefine the symphonic form forever. This heroic energy coursed through his works of the next decade: the Rasumovsky quartets, the Waldstein and Appassionata sonatas, and the towering Fifth and Sixth pastoral symphonies. Even in the oratorio Christ on the Mount of Olives, the opera Fidelio, and the violin concerto, Beethoven infused his music with the same dramatic scope and emotional gravity. In 1810, the critic E.T.A. Hoffmann hailed him as the greatest of all Romantic composers, writing that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony sets in motion terror, fear, horror, pain, and awakens the infinite yearning that is the essence of Romanticism. Beethoven's success, however, was not only artistic. During this period, he earned his income through publishing, private performances, and patronage. Among his patrons, none was more important than Archduke Rudolph of Austria, the youngest son of Emperor Leopold II, who became Beethoven's student and lifelong friend. Beethoven would dedicate 14 works to Rudolph, including the Grand Archduke Trio. Yet triumph was always shadowed by struggle. In 1804, his position at the Theater an der Wien was terminated, slowing progress on his opera Leonore, later retitled Fidelio, which premiered in 1805 to an almost empty theater. Vienna was under French occupation. Both financially and critically, it was a failure, forcing him to revise it multiple times before it finally found success. Still, recognition grew abroad. Muzio Clementi secured rights to publish his music in England, and Prince Esterházy commissioned the Mass in C for his wife's name day. Beethoven continued to challenge himself and his audiences with works of unprecedented complexity and scale. In December 1808, he organized a monumental benefit concert at the Theater an der Wien, featuring the premieres of both the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, the Fourth Piano Concerto, and the Choral Fantasy. The event, which lasted over 4 hours, was under-rehearsed and chaotic. At one point, Beethoven reportedly shouted at the orchestra, "Wrong!" again. But it remains one of the most astonishing nights in musical history. A year later, his career reached a crossroads. Having been offered a prestigious position as Kapellmeister by King Jerome Bonaparte in Kassel, Beethoven considered leaving Vienna. To keep him, his patrons Archduke Rudolf, Prince Kinsky, and Prince Lobkowitz promised him a lifetime pension of 4,000 florins if he stayed. Though economic turmoil later reduced their contributions, this arrangement granted Beethoven something few composers before him had known: artistic independence. But even that independence could not shield him from the turmoil of Europe. When Napoleon's forces bombarded Vienna in 1809, Beethoven took refuge in the cellar of his brother's house, covering his ears with pillows to protect what little hearing he had left. Out of that year's turbulence came new music, the Fifth Piano Concerto, later known as the Emperor Concerto, and the reflective Les Adieux Sonata, written in honor of Archduke Rudolph's departure and return to Vienna. By the dawn of the 1810s, Beethoven stood as Europe's greatest living composer, a man who could no longer hear the world, yet had somehow managed to redefine it through sound. By the close of 1809, Beethoven's creative energy was undimmed despite illness, deafness, and the turbulence of Europe. That year, he received a commission to compose incidental music for Goethe's play Egmont, a story of heroism, freedom, and sacrifice that deeply resonated with his own artistic spirit. The result, completed in 1810, included the famous Egmont Overture and 9 additional pieces, all imbued with the same grandeur and emotional intensity that defined his heroic period. The music's defiant tone mirrored Beethoven's own belief in the power of human courage against tyranny, and it marked the beginning of his growing admiration for Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Through Bettina Brentano, a mutual friend and writer, Beethoven learned more about Goethe and even set 3 of the poet's works to music, Opern 83. Around the same time, he produced other notable compositions that reflected his evolving style: the brooding F minor string quartet, which he titled Quartetto Serioso, and the noble B-flat major piano trio, later known as the Archduke Trio, dedicated to his loyal patron, Archduke Rudolph. In 1811, Beethoven's health sharply declined. He suffered severe headaches and high fevers, and his physician, Dr. Johann Malfatti, advised him to seek treatment at the spa town of Teplitz, now Teplice in the Czech Republic. During this convalescence, Beethoven continued to compose, writing overtures and incidental music for 2 plays by August von Kotzebue, King Stephen and the Ruins of Athens. When he returned to Teplitz in 1812, fate arranged a historic meeting between Beethoven and Goethe. Their encounter, though mutually respectful, revealed the gulf between the tempestuous composer and the refined poet. Goethe wrote afterward, "His talent amazed me. Unfortunately, he is an utterly untamed personality who does not make the world any more enjoyable by his attitude." Beethoven, equally frank, told his publisher, "Goethe delights far too much in the court atmosphere, far more than is becoming in a poet." Yet the admiration remained. Deeply moved by Goethe's poetry, Beethoven composed the choral work, Mir stille und glückliche Fahrt, Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, completed in 1815 and later published in 1822 with a dedication to the poet himself. In a letter accompanying the dedication, Beethoven confessed, "The admiration, the love, and the esteem which I cherished in my youth for the one and only immortal Goethe have persisted. It was a fitting tribute, one great artist saluting another. And through the Egmont Overture, Beethoven had already done what few could. He transformed Goethe's words into pure sound, heroic, tragic, and eternal." As Beethoven's fame grew and his music deepened, so too did the complexity of his personal life. Behind the thunder of his symphonies and the brilliance of his piano sonatas was a man marked by solitude, a man who longed for love but seemed destined to lose it. His hearing was fading, his health faltering, yet his heart remained restless. And it was during one of his retreats at Teplitz in 1812, amid the quiet rhythm of spa days and mountain air, that Beethoven penned one of the most haunting documents of his life, a 10-page letter to his immortal beloved. The letter, never sent, was filled with passion and despair, written to a woman whose identity has remained one of classical music's most enduring mysteries. For generations, scholars debated who she might have been. The most convincing argument, proposed by musicologist Maynard Solomon, points to Antonie Brentano, though others, Julie Guicciardi, Thérèse Malfatti, and Josephine Brunswick, have also been considered possible recipients. Each had, at some point, stirred Beethoven's heart. Julie Guicciardi, the young countess to whom Beethoven had dedicated the Moonlight Sonata, had once been the focus of his affection. But while she enjoyed his attention, she did not return it with seriousness. She married Wenzel Robert von Gallenberg in 1803, leaving Beethoven to claim later, somewhat bitterly, that she had sought him out, crying, but that he had scorned her. Josephine Brunswick, perhaps the truest object of his love, had married the older Count Joseph Daim in 1799. After Daim's death in 1804, Beethoven's visits to her became frequent and emotional. Their letters reveal a man torn between devotion and resignation. When Josephine later moved to Budapest, he continued to write, though the correspondence grew increasingly one-sided. His final message to her, written in 1807, was tinged with quiet sorrow. "I thank you for wishing still to appear as if I were not altogether banished from your memory." Then came Thérèse Malfatti, the 19-year-old niece of Beethoven's doctor. In 1810, Beethoven, now 40, proposed marriage. She declined. The rejection left a mark, though she would later live on in memory through one of Beethoven's most famous miniatures, the tender piano piece Für Elise. But it was Antonie Brentano, married to the merchant Franz Brentano, who may have stirred the deepest affection of all. Introduced to Beethoven by her sister-in-law Bettina Brentano, Antonie shared with him a warmth and understanding rare in his turbulent life. Their connection, likely romantic, unfolded between 1811 and 1812, the very period in which the Immortal Beloved letter was written. When Antonie left Vienna later that year, she and Beethoven never met again. In her old age, she would still speak of him with tenderness, describing him as one of the greatest and most misunderstood souls. Some have even speculated that Beethoven fathered Antony's son, Carl Joseph, born in 1813, who suffered lifelong illness and cognitive difficulties. Whether true or not, the story adds yet another shadow to the portrait of a man who could express love with unmatched beauty in music, but rarely find it in life. In his letter to the immortal beloved, Beethoven wrote, "Ever thine, ever mine, ever ours." 3 simple phrases, perhaps the most intimate notes he ever composed, left behind as the echo of a love that could not be lived. As Beethoven entered his 40s, the heroic flame that had defined his middle years began to flicker under the weight of exhaustion, illness, and solitude. His triumphs had made him immortal in sound, but in life he grew increasingly restless, burdened by failing health, strained friendships, and the ghosts of loves that had never been fulfilled. The year 1812 had ended with his encounter with Goethe and the writing of the immortal beloved letter, but by 1813, the tone of Beethoven's life began to darken. He was emotionally drained, his creativity slowed, and his once neat appearance grew disheveled. Friends noticed a change. The proud composer who once commanded the salons of Vienna now seemed withdrawn and often irritable, muttering to himself in public and showing little concern for manners, even when dining. Beneath these outward signs of decline lay deeper troubles, family turmoil that would soon consume much of his attention. At the end of 1812, Beethoven had visited his brother Johann, who was living with Therese Obermeier, a woman with an illegitimate child. Scandalized, Beethoven tried to end the relationship, appealing even to local authorities, but Johann ignored his pleas and married Therese on the 8th of November, 1812. The episode left Beethoven frustrated and increasingly distrustful of those closest to him. Worse still was the steady decline of his other brother Caspar, who suffered from tuberculosis. Beethoven lent him money, 1,500 florins, hoping to ease his condition, but the illness proved fatal. When Caspar died on the 15th of November 1815, he left behind a widow, Johanna, and a 9-year-old son, Karl. In his grief, Beethoven turned his energy toward one purpose, securing custody of his nephew. What followed was a long, bitter custody battle that would dominate his later years. Though Caspar's will initially named Beethoven as guardian, a later revision granted joint custody to Johanna. Beethoven, who despised his sister-in-law and deemed her unfit, fought fiercely in court to remove the boy from her care. He succeeded briefly in 1816, sending Karl to a private school, but lost guardianship in 1818 when he failed to prove noble birth before the court of the nobility. Undeterred, he continued his legal fight and finally regained custody in 1820. But victory came at a cost. Beethoven's protectiveness soon turned suffocating. His letters to Karl were filled with strict moral instruction and emotional pressure. To the boy, his uncle's love often felt like imprisonment. To Beethoven, it was a sacred duty, his final attempt to build a family where life had left him none. Thus began one of the most turbulent chapters of Beethoven's life, a period marked not by grand symphonies, but by silence, conflict, and the painful unraveling of a man who once spoke only through beauty. After years marked by personal turmoil, legal struggles, and creative stagnation, Ludwig van Beethoven found renewed motivation to compose in June 1813. News of the French defeat at the Battle of Vittoria under the Duke of Wellington stirred patriotic enthusiasm across Europe, and Beethoven responded to the moment. His friend and inventor, Johann Nepomuk Melzel, persuaded him to write a celebratory work for a new mechanical instrument called the panharmonicon. Beethoven later transcribed the composition for full orchestra, releasing it as Wellington's Victory, also known as the Battle Symphony. The work premiered on the 8th of December 1813, alongside his Seventh Symphony, at a charity concert in Vienna organized to aid soldiers wounded in the war. The concert was a great success and was repeated 4 days later. The orchestra included several prominent musicians present in Vienna at the time, such as Giacomo Meyerbeer and Domenico Dragonetti. The following year, Beethoven conducted additional performances in January and February 1814, which proved to be the most financially successful concerts of his career. The earnings allowed him to purchase bank shares that would later form a significant portion of his estate. The success of Wellington's Victory renewed public interest in Beethoven's earlier works. There was a demand for a revival of his opera Fidelio, which returned to the stage in a third revised version in July 1814, and finally received widespread acclaim. Beethoven's publisher, Artaria, commissioned the young Ignaz Moscheles to prepare a piano arrangement of the opera. When Moscheles inscribed his score with the words, "Finished with God's help," Beethoven humorously added, "Oh man, help thyself." That same summer, Beethoven completed his first piano sonata in 5 years, the Sonata in E minor, Opus 90. Later that year, as Vienna became host to the Congress of Vienna, Beethoven composed several patriotic works, including the cantata Der glorreiche Augenblick, the glorious moment, written to honor the gathering of European leaders. While these pieces broadened his public popularity, they did little to enhance his standing among critics as a serious composer. In April and May 1814, Beethoven made his final public appearances as a solo pianist, performing his Archduke Trio. The composer Louis Spohr, who was present, noted sadly that Beethoven's deafness had become unmistakable. The piano was badly out of tune, which Beethoven minded little, since he did not hear it. There was scarcely anything left of the virtuosity of the artist. By this time, Beethoven relied heavily on ear trumpets, designed by Melzel, to communicate, several of which survive today at the Beethoven House in Bonn. In 1815, his creative energy began to fade again. He produced a second, more dramatic setting of the poem An die Hoffnung, to hope, a pair of cello sonatas, and a few shorter works. He also began, but soon abandoned, a sixth piano concerto. The decline in productivity reflected not a loss of genius, but a man increasingly encircled by illness, isolation, and silence. Between 1815 and 1819, Beethoven entered one of the quietest and most challenging phases of his mature life. His creative output dwindled to a level unmatched since his youth, and the once prolific composer found himself struggling against illness, exhaustion, and deep personal frustration. He blamed part of this creative stagnation on an inflammatory fever that afflicted him for more than a year, beginning in October 1816. Yet illness was only part of the reason. The long and bitter custody battle over his nephew Karl consumed his attention, while the shifting tides of music in Europe left him feeling increasingly alienated from the world he had once led. By the late 1810s, the Romantic movement was reshaping European art, embracing themes of the supernatural and the sentimental, traits found in the operas of Carl Maria von Weber, Heinrich Marschner, and Louis Spohr. Beethoven, however, remained firmly rooted in the classical ideals of structure, counterpoint, and discipline. he rejected the growing romantic preference for brief, lyrical mood pieces and instead turned inward, studying the works of Bach, Handel, and Palestrina, seeking a deeper sense of purity and balance in his art. Despite his struggles, Beethoven still produced a few remarkable works during this period. Among them were his song cycle An die ferne Geliebte, To the Distant Beloved, composed in 1816, which became the first true song cycle in classical music, and the monumental Hammerklavier Sonata, completed in 1818, a work of immense technical and emotional power. Around the same time, he began sketching ideas that would eventually grow into the Ninth Symphony, seeds of a masterpiece that would not bloom until years later. By early 1818, Beethoven's health showed some improvement, and his nephew Karl, then 11 years old, came to live with him. Their relationship, however, was uneasy. Within a year, Karl's mother regained custody through the courts, reigniting Beethoven's resentment and deepening his sense of isolation. By this time, his hearing had deteriorated almost completely, forcing him to communicate through conversation books, in which visitors wrote their replies while he responded aloud. These notebooks, which survive in large numbers, provide a rare and intimate window into his daily life. His thoughts on music, publishing, household affairs, and the philosophies that guided his late works. Beethoven's personal life was steadied somewhat by the friendship of Nanette Streicher, the owner of the Stein Piano Workshop, who helped manage his household during his illnesses. Her assistance, even providing him with a reliable cook, brought a small measure of order to his often chaotic home. In 1818, Beethoven received a gesture of admiration from abroad. Thomas Broadwood, a leading English piano maker, presented him with one of his finest instruments as a gift from London. Beethoven expressed deep gratitude, but was too frail to accept the Philharmonic Society's invitation to visit England, a journey he had long dreamed of making. Though his world had grown smaller, confined by illness, silence, and solitude, Beethoven's inner world was only growing vaster. The fire that once thundered through symphonies and concertos now smoldered quietly, waiting for its final eruption in the immortal works of his late period. By 1819, Beethoven's life was defined by contradiction, outwardly burdened by illness, legal disputes, and social withdrawal, yet inwardly preparing for a new creative awakening. His ongoing custody battles over his nephew Karl consumed much of his energy, demanding endless petitions and correspondence. But amid these struggles, two significant events rekindled his compositional drive and marked the beginning of his final great period. The first was the promotion of Archduke Rudolf, Beethoven's longtime friend and patron, to Cardinal Archbishop of Olomouc. Wishing to honor him, Beethoven began work on what would become one of his most monumental achievements, the Missa Solemnis. Initially intended for Rudolph's installation ceremony in March 1820, the piece grew in scope and ambition, taking Beethoven 4 years to complete. The second spark came from a simple publishing invitation. Anton Diabelli, a Viennese music dealer, had sent a short waltz theme to 50 composers, asking each to write a variation. Beethoven's competitive spirit was instantly ignited. By mid-1819, he had already composed 20 variations and eventually expanded them into the 33 Diabelli variations, one of the most profound works for piano ever written. During the same year, Archduke Rudolf paid tribute to his teacher by composing 40 piano variations on a theme Beethoven had written for him, a gesture of deep respect and friendship. Around this time, several portraits of Beethoven were painted, including one by Ferdinand Schimann, which became the most widely recognized image of the composer for the next century. Beethoven's work on the Missa Solemnis was not motivated by religious devotion in the traditional sense. Though raised a Catholic, he had long since developed a more philosophical spirituality. His private notes and diary, Tagebuch, from these years reveal his fascination with the ancient writings of India and Egypt and the Rig Veda, reflecting a belief in a universal, personal God rather than institutional faith. In a letter to Archduke Rudolf in 1821, he wrote, "God sees into my innermost heart and knows that as a man I perform most conscientiously and on all occasions the duties which humanity, God, and nature enjoin upon me." In his sketches for the Missa Solemnis, he even wrote the words, "Plea for inner and outer peace." Despite his isolation, Beethoven's reputation in Vienna remained formidable. His music was regularly performed in Franz Xaver Gebauer's Concert Spirituels, which featured all 8 of his completed symphonies, as well as the Mass in C and the Oratorio Christus am Ölberge. Yet Beethoven's pride often overshadowed his gratitude. When a friend mentioned Gebauer's name in conversation, Beethoven scrawled a punning reply in a conversation book, "Geh Bauer," meaning "begone, peasant." That same year, Beethoven was approached by the Berlin publisher Moritz Schlesinger, whose warmth and a plate of roast veal won over the cautious composer. Schlesinger secured the rights to publish Beethoven's final 3 piano sonatas and his last string quartets, promising wide distribution across Germany, France, and England. The first of these sonatas, the Sonata in E major, Opus 109, dedicated to Maximilian Brentano, daughter of Antonie Brentano, was sent to the publisher at the end of 1820. By 1821, Beethoven's health had again declined. He suffered from rheumatism and jaundice, yet continued to work tirelessly. He completed the Sonata in A-flat major, Opus 110, that December, and pressed on with the Missa Solemnis. Around this time, he also reconciled with his estranged brother Johann, who began assisting him with finances and business affairs, even lending him money secured against his compositions. Beethoven also attempted a fragile peace with Johanna, the mother of his nephew Karl, though Karl himself resented the gesture. In late 1822, Beethoven's fortunes began to rise again. He received 2 prestigious commissions that would define the remainder of his life's work. The Philharmonic Society of London invited him to compose a symphony, a proposal that would lead to the 9th Symphony, and Prince Nikolai Galitzin of St. Petersburg commissioned 3 string quartets, offering an unusually high fee of 50 ducats per piece. That same year, a young Anton Schindler entered Beethoven's life, first as an assistant and later as a self-appointed biographer. Although Schindler's later accounts proved unreliable in many respects, he was present during these final years and offered Beethoven practical help, if not genuine friendship. The composer's portrait in 1823, painted by Ferdinand Georg Waldmüller, captures him as he was then, solemn, weary, but unbroken. The man who once stormed the concert halls of Vienna now lived mostly in silence. Yet, within that silence, the most profound music of his life was still forming. By 1823, Ludwig van Beethoven stood on the summit of his creative life. In that single year, he completed 3 monumental works that had occupied his mind and heart for years: the Missa Solemnis, the 9th Symphony, and the Diabelli Variations. These compositions marked not only the culmination of his artistic journey, but also the transformation of his suffering into sublime expression. He presented the finished Missa Solemnis to his longtime patron Archduke Rudolf on the 19th of March, 1823, more than a year after the Archduke's enthronement as Archbishop of Olomouc. Yet Beethoven delayed its publication, believing he could sell manuscript copies to the royal courts of Europe at a handsome price of 50 ducats each. Few accepted, though one who did was Louis XVIII of France, who sent the composer a gold medallion in gratitude. The Ninth Symphony and the Diabelli variations consumed most of his remaining energy that year. Publishers fiercely competed for the rights to the Missa Solemnis, with Schlesinger, Peters, and Schott all vying for it, the latter eventually securing the prized score. But beneath these triumphs, Beethoven grew increasingly disillusioned with Vienna. He complained to the critic Johann Friedrich Rochlitz that his music was no longer appreciated. "You will hear nothing of me here. Fidelio, they cannot give it. The symphonies, they have no time for them. Fashion is everything disheartened." He considered premiering his new works in Berlin, where audiences were said to be more serious. Alarmed, his Viennese supporters persuaded him to stay, a decision that led to one of the most historic evenings in music history. On 7th May 1824, at the Kärntner Tortheater, Vienna heard the first performance of the Ninth Symphony and portions of the Missa Solemnis. Deaf and unaware of the audience's roaring applause, Beethoven stood beside conductor Michael Umlauf, beating time with his baton long after the music had stopped, until one of the singers gently turned him to face the cheering crowd. The Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung hailed the performance, declaring that inexhaustible genius had shown us a new world. Even Karl Czerny, his former student, marveled that it carried a youthful spirit, so much power, innovation, and beauty. The concert, though a triumph in spirit, brought little financial gain. Expenses outweighed earnings. A second performance later that month drew a smaller crowd as many Viennese had left the city for the countryside. It would be Beethoven's final public appearance. Distrust soon soured his relations with his assistant Anton Schindler, whom he accused of mismanaging ticket money. Schindler was replaced by Karl Holz of the Schuppanzig Quartet, though the two men later reconciled. In the years that followed, Beethoven devoted himself to the string quartets commissioned by Prince Galitzin, works that would become the cornerstone of his late style. The first, the quartet in E-flat major, Opera No. 127, premiered in March 1825. While composing the next, Opera No. 132 in a minor, he was struck by severe illness, but upon recovery expressed his gratitude in the slow movement, titled Holy Song of Thanksgiving, to the divinity from a convalescent. His later quartets, Opus 130, Op. 131, and Opus 135, would take him further into introspection, abstraction, and spiritual depth. The final years were shadowed by family turmoil. His relationship with his nephew Karl grew increasingly strained. In August 1826, after months of tension and Beethoven's disapproval of his mother's influence, Karl attempted suicide. Though he survived, the event devastated Beethoven. The two retreated to Gneixendorf, where Beethoven completed his last quartet, Oppinger 135, inscribing its final movement with the words, Muss es sein, must it be? And the answer, Es muss sein, it must be. The haunting question, half philosophical, half personal, seemed to echo through the composer's own failing body. By November 1826, he completed his last piece of music, a replacement finale for Opus 130. Weakened, irritable, and estranged from his brother Johann, he spent his final months ill and despondent. Yet even in decline, his pen carved out music that transcended mortality. The deaf, ailing man who could no longer hear a single note had somehow written sounds that would never fade. In December 1826, on his journey back to Vienna from Gneixendorf, Beethoven's frail health finally collapsed. What began as fatigue soon worsened into fever, jaundice, and painful swelling of the limbs. His doctor, Andreas Ignaz Wawruch, noted the unmistakable signs of dropsy, a buildup of fluid caused by liver failure. Beethoven endured repeated operations to drain his abdomen, each leaving him weaker than before. By his side through the early weeks was his nephew Karl, who had survived his suicide attempt only months earlier. But in January 1827, Karl departed to join the army at Iglau. Before leaving, he wrote to his uncle, now bedridden and silent, a letter that read, "My dear father, I am living in contentment and regret only that I am separated from you." Soon after, Beethoven wrote his final will, naming Karl as his sole heir. As the composer's condition worsened, friends and admirers from across Vienna came to pay their respects. Diabelli, Schuppanzee, Lichnowsky, Schindler, Hummel, and the young Ferdinand Hiller all visited him during those last months. Tokens of affection arrived from afar, 100 pounds from the Philharmonic Society of London, and a case of fine wine from the Schott Publishing House. Beethoven, confined to his bed and barely able to move, received them with faint gratitude. In late March, the end drew near. On March 24th, a priest administered the last rites. That same day, Beethoven managed a faint smile and whispered to those gathered, "Plaudit, amici, commedia finita est." Applaud, my friends. The comedy is over. Later, when the long-awaited case of wine arrived, he murmured his final words, "Pity. Too late." 2 days later, on March 26, 1827, at around 5 p.m., Ludwig van Beethoven died. Only 2 people were present, his friend Anselm Hüttenbrenner and a woman known only as Frau von Beethoven, possibly his old adversary Johanna. Hüttenbrenner later described the moment with quiet reverence. A flash of lightning illuminated the room. Beethoven's eyes opened one last time, his right hand lifted defiantly, and then fell. He was 56 years old. In the hours that followed, visitors came to see his body. Friends clipped locks of his hair as keepsakes. An autopsy revealed the toll of years of suffering, severe liver damage, likely from alcohol and illness, and deterioration of the auditory nerves that had silenced the world for him long before death did. On March 29, 1827, Vienna mourned. Nearly 10,000 people filled the streets for Beethoven's funeral procession. Among the torchbearers walked Franz Schubert, who would himself die the following year. The poet, Franz Grillparzer, wrote and delivered the eulogy, calling Beethoven the artist who inherited the spirit of Mozart and carried it into a new world. Beethoven's body was laid to rest in the Währing Cemetery, following a solemn requiem mass at the Church of the Holy Trinity. Decades later, his remains were exhumed in 1863 for study, and in 1888, they were reinterred at Vienna's Zentralfriedhof, beside Franz Schubert. 2 souls who, in death, found the peace they had rarely known in life. And so ends the story of a man who could no longer hear the world, yet taught it how to listen. May his silence bring you peace tonight. Good night.